It was Wednesday at 6:15 a.m., and I was halfway through pouring my coffee when they blew up my great-grandfather's dam. By the time I slammed into the driveway, a century of hand-cut limestone lay scattered in smoking piles, and right there, planted like he owned the place, stood HOA President Colin Grant, smiling like he'd just hit the jackpot, brushing dust off his overpriced polo. "Free demolition," he said with a smug tilt of his head. "That little swamp of yours was killing our property values." What that idiot didn't understand was that the swamp had been holding back floodwater for the entire valley since 1926. He hadn't removed an eyesore, he'd pulled the cork out of a ticking bomb, with spring snowmelt only 6 weeks away. The sharp chemical bite of explosives still hung in the air while Colin snapped victory selfies, completely unaware he'd just turned his $760,000 McMansion into future lakefront property, Old Testament style. What would you do if someone destroyed your family's legacy and then posted grinning selfies about it? My name is Noah Rivers. I'm a hydraulic engineer, and I thought inheriting 11 acres in Colorado would be the clean reset I needed after my divorce detonated my life. Instead, I got a front-row seat to small-town corruption so blatant it would make a big city politician blush. My property sits upstream from Riverstone Estates, one of those identical cookie-cutter developments where every oversized house looks like it came out of the same beige mold. My great-grandfather, Edwin Rivers, built our stone dam back in 1926 during the Depression when men shaped rock by hand and didn't need permission slips to move a boulder. That dam created a 2.7-acre pond that's been the heart of our land for nearly 100 years. Morning mist rises off the water like breath. You hear the steady hush of water spilling over limestone worn smooth by time. At dawn, the smell of wet soil and cattails fills the air, mixed with that thin, metallic mountain oxygen. It's quiet in a way that feels earned. I moved back to start a sustainable aquaculture operation, raising trout, growing organic vegetables using the pond's natural irrigation. Simple plan: heal from the divorce wreckage, honor my family's work, and maybe make enough money to forget my ex-wife's name ever existed. Turns out, fresh starts are magnets for fresh disasters. Enter Colin Grant. Picture a man who drives a BMW X6 and still calls it a Beamer. 51 years old, real estate developer, HOA president for 7 straight years. The type who wears pressed khakis to neighborhood cookouts and thinks anything that looks natural is a threat to resale value. Colin had grand plans for Riverstone Estates, luxury resort vibes, manicured greens, spa facilities. My pond didn't fit his fantasy of sterile perfection. The first strike came in the mail. A certified letter, thick as a legal textbook, landed in my box on a Friday morning. According to the HOA's legal department, I owed $10,800 in unpaid assessments for community water management services. Services I'd never requested, never received, never agreed to. And my dam? An unauthorized structure, violating community standards. Remove it within 30 days or face $450 per day in fines. 10 grand in fabricated fees plus daily penalties unless I destroyed a century-old flood control structure that had protected their subdivision since before electricity was common. I called Colin directly, thinking reason might exist. "Our family never joined your HOA," I said. "This land predates your development by decades." His laugh sounded like a blender chewing glass. "Doesn't matter, Noah. Water flows into our community. You're using shared resources. Pay up or tear it down." Then he said the quiet part out loud. "That swamp of yours drags down value. Maybe sell to someone who understands civilization." The crunch of gravel as his BMW pulled away told me everything. This wasn't about fees or standards. It was about power, and my land sat in the way of his expansion plans. I hired a lawyer that afternoon and learned something beautiful. My great-grandfather had explicitly refused HOA membership when Riverstone was formed in 1956, and county surveys showed conflicting boundary records. Legally, the case was strong. Colin didn't care. Within a week, inspectors started appearing like pests. Anonymous complaints about fence height, mailbox color, noise from my coffee grinder, safety inspections designed to bleed me dry through fines and legal costs.
Colin made one mistake. You don't start a bureaucratic war with someone who designs water systems for a living, especially when you live downhill from his dam. 3 weeks later, his real move came. A county building inspector named Mark Ellison showed up with a clipboard and an attitude. Reports say your dam's structurally unsound. Emergency assessment. He spent 20 minutes poking 100-year-old limestone with a screwdriver, never measuring, never photographing, just scribbling notes and grunting for effect. The report arrived the next morning. Immediate demolition required due to catastrophic failure risk. The document claimed the dam showed foundation erosion typical of 1960s concrete construction. I almost spit my coffee across the room. The dam was limestone, built in 1926. Concrete residential dams didn't exist here until decades later. Ellison hadn't examined anything. He'd filed a fabricated report. So I hired Westbrook Structural, the firm that certified half the bridges in the state. Cost me $2,700 I didn't have, worth every cent. Their engineers spent 6 hours inspecting every stone, measuring flow rates, testing mortar joints with equipment worth more than my truck. The conclusion was brutal. Structure exceeds modern safety standards by over 190%. Estimated lifespan exceeds 450 years with routine maintenance. 450 years. My great-grandfather had built something that would outlive every one of Colin's beige mansions. I filed complaints with the state engineering board, the county prosecutor, and the local paper. When officials falsify emergency reports, they become personally liable. Ellison had painted a legal target on his own back. While I built my case, Colin launched his smear campaign. "Dangerous dam threatens community safety," screamed headlines. Flyers with stock photos of dam failures appeared on doorsteps. A petition circulated. 53 homeowners signed it, so I invited them to see the actual dam. 20 showed up on a Saturday. I walked them through the basics, how controlled overflow prevents flooding, how removing the structure would send spring runoff straight into their streets. By noon, 15 had withdrawn their signatures. Colin wasn't done. The following Wednesday at 6:15 a.m., county demolition trucks rolled into my driveway, despite pending appeals. Workers unloaded equipment while a supervisor waived Ellison's fake emergency order. I blocked the access road with my pickup and started making calls. 20 minutes later, Colin arrived with 2 sheriff's deputies claiming I was obstructing public safety. That's when the camera showed up. Local news doesn't cover routine demolitions. They do cover corruption allegations involving police and private property. Channel footage caught Colin trying to explain why a dam that stood safely for 97 years suddenly needed emergency removal right after his inspector friend got reported. And that's where things started to turn.
The footage from Channel 8 barely finished airing before Colin Grant pivoted to the next lever of pressure, because men like him never stop when they're exposed. They just escalate. And by Thursday afternoon, the Riverstone Herald was running a front-page story about aging private dam endangering community safety, complete with anonymous quotes from concerned residents who sounded suspiciously like they had been fed lines. According to the article, experts warned that my pond was a disaster waiting to happen, that it could fail at any moment and wash away homes, even though the same structure had safely handled every spring runoff since Calvin Coolidge was president. Colin leaned hard into the narrative, organizing door-to-door visits with glossy flyers showing dramatic photos of dam collapses from other states, none of them mine, asking neighbors if they really wanted to gamble with their family's safety. 53 signatures turned into 49, then 46. But he didn't care about the math. He cared about momentum, about keeping the noise loud enough that facts got drowned out. That noise brought the next player to my door 3 days later, a county official named Darren Cole, who introduced himself as an environmental compliance officer and immediately started talking like he'd already made up his mind. He claimed my pond was creating stagnant conditions, breeding mosquitoes, and threatening public health, and he said it while standing next to water so clear you could see trout flashing near the surface. He spent maybe 10 minutes inspecting before declaring the site problematic, scribbling notes without taking samples, then drove off in a county truck like he'd just checked a box. The pattern was obvious now. Fabricate concern, file paperwork, apply pressure, repeat.
So instead of panicking, I documented everything. Photos, timestamps, audio recordings, copies of every letter. When Cole's report arrived claiming dangerous bacteria levels in anaerobic zones, I forwarded it to Northridge Environmental Labs, paid $1,900, and asked for a full analysis. Their scientists spent an entire day collecting samples, measuring dissolved oxygen, cataloging species, and their conclusion landed like a hammer. The pond was one of the healthiest freshwater systems they tested that year, with balanced nutrients, strong oxygenation, and zero indicators of contamination. The lab director even called personally, sounding offended that someone had accused such clean water of being hazardous. I sent that report everywhere, including to Cole's supervisor and the same paper that had printed Colin's fear piece. Meanwhile, Colin tried to move the chessboard. He leaned on a city councilman named Trevor Hale, another golf buddy, who suddenly introduced a proposal about regulating pre-1955 water retention structures for environmental review. Funny how that description fit exactly one structure in the county. I attended the council meeting, sat through recycled air and rehearsed speeches, and waited until public comment to ask a simple question: how many such structures existed besides mine? Hale shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, and said the ordinance was about proactive planning, not targeting. That's when I stood up and disclosed that I'd pulled development filings showing Colin-controlled LLCs owning 44% of the upstream parcels and had already submitted concept plans for an $11.4 million resort complex that required removing my dam to reroute water into decorative ponds. You could hear chairs creak as council members leaned back, suddenly uncomfortable, and the vote was postponed for further study, which is politicians speak for backing away slowly. Colin responded by tightening the screws. Private investigators followed me to the grocery store. My mailbox got clipped by a snowplow twice in 1 week. My truck was reported abandoned whenever I parked downtown. The harassment was petty, constant, and designed to wear me down, but it had the opposite effect on the neighborhood. At the next HOA meeting, homeowners started asking where their dues were going, why legal fees kept climbing, why emergency expenses never seemed to end. A retired accountant named Linda Perez requested financial statements and didn't like what she saw. Payments to grant advisory services, landscaping invoices triple the market rate, maintenance contracts with companies that didn't exist. When she started asking questions out loud, the room shifted. Colin tried to bulldoze through it, declared the meeting adjourned, but people didn't leave. They stayed, talking, comparing notes, realizing that the man who claimed to protect their investments was siphoning money like it was his personal ATM. By Sunday night, Linda and 2 other board members had called an emergency meeting without Colin, citing bylaw provisions he'd assumed nobody read. I showed up not as a speaker, but as a witness, because I'd been quietly gathering records too, copies of checks, vendor filings, corporate addresses that all traced back to Colin. When Linda laid it out, line by line, the room erupted. Someone shouted fraud, someone else demanded a forensic audit. A motion passed to suspend Colin's authority pending investigation, and for the first time since this started, he looked genuinely rattled. He stormed out, yelling about ungrateful neighbors and legal consequences, but the damage was done. The next morning, he filed something desperate, an emergency petition claiming the HOA had inherent authority to seize my property for public safety under eminent domain. The paperwork looked official, seals and signatures copied just well enough to fool someone who didn't know better, and it was scheduled for a quick vote on 9:30 a.m. on a holiday-adjacent Monday when turnout would be thin. Except it wasn't thin. Linda had alerted the neighborhood, I'd alerted the press, and by the time the council convened, the room was packed. When Colin's attorney argued that immediate action was necessary to avert disaster, I stood and submitted documentation showing Colin had been removed from authority the night before for financial misconduct. I also submitted the lab reports, the structural assessment, and the development filings tying his push directly to profit. The council tabled the petition unanimously. That should have ended it. It didn't. 2 days later, county demolition equipment appeared at my gate again under the pretense of emergency stabilization, which somehow involved explosive charges. The supervisor waved an outdated order, shrugged when I told him it had been invalidated, and said he was just following instructions. That was the moment I realized Colin was done pretending. If he couldn't win legally, he'd force the outcome and deal with consequences later. I called my great-grandfather's old attorney, Harold Quinn, now in his 90s but still sharper than most people half his age. He told me to come immediately. In his office, surrounded by yellowed files, he pulled out a contract dated 1955, a flood control agreement between my family and the county, granting us responsibility and authority to manage downstream flow in perpetuity. Interfering with that infrastructure wasn't just illegal, it was a federal violation with personal liability attached. Harold smiled like a man who'd seen this movie before and said, if they touch that dam, they own everything that happens next. I left his office knowing the game had changed, that this wasn't just about saving a pond anymore. It was about letting a reckless man learn what happens when you fight physics with paperwork. And somewhere in the background, snowpack reports were climbing, forecasts tightening, the mountains loading water like a drawn bow, waiting for release.
Knowing about the 1955 flood control contract changed everything, because from that moment forward, Colin Grant wasn't just trying to bully a private landowner, he was positioning himself to interfere with federally recognized infrastructure, and people who do that tend to discover very quickly that the law has teeth. I didn't rush back to the property waving paperwork like a victory flag. I slowed down instead, because rushing is how mistakes happen, and mistakes were exactly what Colin was counting on. While he was leaning on county contacts and pretending he still had authority he'd already lost, I started building a record so airtight it would survive any courtroom. I requested certified copies of the flood control agreement from the county archive, pulled historical runoff data going back 80 years and cross-referenced it with modern snowpack projections. At the same time, I hired Pinnacle Hydrology Group for $2,300, not to argue, but to model what would happen if the dam were compromised during peak melt. Their lead analyst spent a full week feeding numbers into simulations, and when he called me, his voice had lost its casual tone. Without the dam, he said, runoff volumes would exceed channel capacity within hours, sending water straight into Riverstone's lowest streets. 40 to 45 homes would see significant flooding, some for weeks. That wasn't theory, that was math. While those models were running, Colin escalated again, this time through intimidation. Unknown cars idled near my gate at night. Someone tried to pry open my equipment shed. A warning notice appeared on my fence claiming zoning violations that didn't exist. I logged every incident, every timestamp, every plate number, because patterns matter when prosecutors start asking questions. The pressure campaign didn't just target me, it targeted anyone who sided with me. Linda Perez found her trash cans knocked over repeatedly. One neighbor got a friendly reminder letter about unpaid dues that were, coincidentally, fully paid. It backfired. Nothing unites people faster than realizing someone is trying to scare them into silence. The HOA revolt hardened. A forensic audit was commissioned, and within 10 days it confirmed what many suspected. Over $165,000 in dues had been routed through shell vendors tied directly to Colin. Landscaping billed for work never done. Legal retainers paid to addresses that matched his own business office. Emergency maintenance invoices dated for days when no work occurred. When the audit summary circulated, it spread faster than any flyer Colin had printed. Meanwhile, county officials began quietly distancing themselves. Phone calls stopped getting returned. Inspectors suddenly found scheduling conflicts. Nobody wanted their name anywhere near a situation that was starting to smell like criminal exposure. That vacuum made Colin reckless. He filed another emergency request, this time framing the dam as an imminent collapse risk due to unknown sabotage, a claim so bold it would have been impressive if it weren't so transparent. The county rejected it within hours, citing lack of evidence, but that didn't stop him from trying to act anyway. Early one morning, just after sunrise, I got a call from a neighbor saying heavy equipment was staged near the access road again. I drove down to find 2 county-marked trucks and a rented excavator idling, operators looking uncomfortable. The supervisor told me they'd been instructed to begin temporary relief cuts to reduce water pressure. Relief cuts are controlled modifications performed by engineers with permits and oversight, not something you do with rented machinery and guesswork. I asked for the work order. He couldn't produce one. I asked for the supervising engineer. There wasn't one. I then handed him a copy of the federal flood control contract and informed him, calmly, that touching the dam without authorization constituted interference with protected infrastructure and would expose him personally to liability. The color drained from his face. He made a phone call, listened for 30 seconds, then waved his crew off. As they pulled away, I knew that had been a test, a probe to see how far Colin could push before someone pushed back harder. That night, I didn't sleep. I reviewed models, weather forecasts, legal statutes, because snowpack reports were getting worse. State data showed 148% of normal accumulation, and a warming trend was projected earlier than average. If the dam failed, intentionally or otherwise, the timeline to flooding wouldn't be weeks, it would be days. I made the decision to prepare for the outcome Colin was clearly steering toward. I installed water level sensors downstream, discrete battery-powered units that transmitted readings every 5 minutes. I placed trail cameras overlooking access points. I coordinated with the local fire chief, explaining the flood control agreement and the modeling results. He listened carefully, then asked me to brief his team. Within 48 hours, emergency response plans were drafted for Riverstone's low-lying blocks, unofficially, quietly, because nobody wanted to spark panic yet. While preparation happened in the background, Colin went loud. He held an impromptu press conference standing in front of a banner that read, "Community Safety First," claiming rogue landowners were putting families at risk by refusing to comply with reasonable regulations. He didn't mention the audit, he didn't mention his removal, he didn't mention his development plans. He framed himself as the victim of an uncooperative engineer who thought he was above the law. The footage would have been convincing if you didn't know the context. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't need to. Facts age well, lies don't. 2 days later, the audit results were leaked to the same outlet that had run Colin's scare stories. The headline shifted tone immediately. HOA funds misused, questions raised about leadership. That was enough to trigger something Colin couldn't control. The district attorney's office opened a preliminary inquiry. It wasn't announced with sirens or press releases. It started with requests for documents and quiet interviews, but Colin knew what it meant. He stopped calling, stopped emailing. That silence was more dangerous than the noise because it meant he was planning something without leaving a trail. The move came at night. Motion alerts pinged my phone just after midnight. 3 figures near the spillway, moving fast, carrying tools. I drove down and stayed back, watching through night vision as they worked at the stone joints, striking, prying, trying to weaken key points without triggering immediate collapse. I called the sheriff and kept recording. Deputies arrived within minutes, lights cutting through the darkness, catching 2 men and 1 who tried to run. One of them turned out to be a subcontractor linked to one of Colin's shell companies. The report read criminal vandalism, but the real damage wasn't just legal. The structural integrity had been compromised enough that my own engineers flagged a failure risk under heavy runoff. Colin had done what he'd been accusing me all along. He'd created the hazard. The next morning, under gray skies, federal authorities stepped in because once protected infrastructure is deliberately damaged, it stops being a local matter. A temporary injunction halted any further interference, but it came with a grim acknowledgement. The dam could no longer safely hold peak flows in its weakened state. Controlled demolition under federal supervision was now the safest option to prevent an uncontrolled failure. I stood there listening to that assessment, feeling the weight of a century settle in my chest. Colin had forced the outcome he wanted, but not on his terms. If the dam came down, it would be documented, modeled, monitored, and every consequence would be traceable back to him. As preparations began, snowmelt alarms started ticking upward in the mountains. The timing was tightening, the margin shrinking, and Colin, for all his schemes, had boxed himself into a corner where gravity didn't care about press conferences or property values. It only cared about release.
The federal injunction bought time, but time was the one thing nobody actually had, because snowmelt doesn't wait for court calendars, and every updated forecast pushed the danger window closer. The Army Corps supervisors moved in with clipboards and hard hats, marking the dam for controlled removal, while my phone filled with alerts from the downstream sensors showing baseline levels creeping upward even before the real thaw began. Colin Grant stayed quiet, which told me more than any threat ever could. Men like him don't go silent unless they're cornered or plotting something reckless enough to blow up in their own hands. While engineers prepared containment channels and temporary berms to guide runoff once the dam was breached, I spent my days briefing officials, neighbors, and anyone who would listen, explaining that this wasn't a punishment or a loss. It was damage control forced by sabotage. Some people understood, others just wanted someone to blame. Fear has a way of simplifying complex truths into convenient villains. News trucks parked along the road, reporters rehearsing lines about controversial removal and ongoing disputes, even though the paperwork clearly showed this was now a federal safety operation. I gave one statement, short and precise, and then stepped back, because spectacle only helps the wrong people. Behind the scenes, the district attorney's inquiry accelerated. Subpoenas went out for HOA financial records, vendor contracts, email correspondence. Linda Perez told me investigators had been in her living room for 3 hours, copying files and asking pointed questions about Colin's spending habits. That pressure cracked something. 2 days before the scheduled demolition, one of Colin's former contractors contacted the DA and cut a deal, handing over messages
images that showed Colin ordering pressure cuts on the dam to create a failure narrative. That testimony transformed the case from civil misconduct into criminal exposure, and suddenly Colin wasn't just fighting me, he was fighting the state. The irony was brutal. He'd tried to force removal to protect property values, and now his actions were guaranteeing maximum damage and maximum liability. The night before demolition, I walked the dam alone, running my hand over limestone my great-grandfather had shaped with tools that didn't have power cords. I didn't romanticize it, I documented it. Photos, measurements, final readings, because engineers don't mourn by pretending structures last forever. They mourn by recording truth. At dawn, crews set charges designed to drop the spillway inward, guiding water into temporary channels. Federal monitors, state engineers, environmental observers, all present, all recording. The blast was controlled, but the sound still punched the valley, a low thunder that echoed off the hills. Water surged forward, not violently, but insistently, reclaiming pathways it had been denied for nearly a century. Within hours, sensors downstream lit up, levels rising, streets damp, basements at risk. Emergency crews moved, evacuating residents from the lowest blocks, exactly as the models predicted. By mid-afternoon, Riverstone Estates looked like a case study in ignored warnings. Lawns disappeared under shallow lakes, roads closed, boats replaced sedans, and at the center of it all, Colin's own house, built squarely in the historic overflow channel, took water first. Cameras caught it, live, water climbing his driveway while he stood on the porch yelling into a phone. That footage went national. By evening, the community center filled with displaced families, shock written on faces that had once signed petitions against my dam. I didn't gloat, I coordinated. I relayed updates, shared timelines, helped emergency teams prioritize homes with elderly residents. When people asked how long the flooding would last, I answered honestly, weeks. Water follows math, not apologies. Sheriff's deputies arrived with a warrant just after sunset. Colin was taken into custody of the community center, still insisting this was unforeseeable, still claiming nobody could have predicted it. A reporter played back his own press conference dismissing flood risks from days earlier. The contrast was surgical. Charges were read out loud: embezzlement, fraud, bribery, environmental violations, criminal negligence. The handcuffs clicked while cameras rolled, and the room exhaled something between relief and disbelief. The next morning, the Attorney General's office announced civil actions to recover damages, pegged initially at $7.6 million, with more assessments pending. Insurance companies denied coverage, citing intentional acts. Colin's assets were frozen. His development LLCs collapsed overnight. Meanwhile, federal disaster relief funds kicked in, not for him, but for the families displaced by his decisions. Over the following weeks, Riverstone changed. Temporary housing went up. Engineers rebuilt channels. Plans for a new flood control structure emerged, this time designed to modern standards, but rooted in the same principles my great-grandfather had used. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The community that tried to erase a century of protection now depended on that same knowledge to survive. Court proceedings moved faster than I expected. Plea deals followed cooperation. Inspectors lost licenses. A councilman resigned. The audit expanded, uncovering $172,000 in misappropriated funds, and restitution orders stacked up. Colin eventually took a deal that spared a long trial, but cemented his downfall. Prison time, lifetime ban from HOA leadership, and personal liability that would follow him for decades. When sentencing came, the judge didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She described how infrastructure exists to protect people who never think about it, how abusing authority to dismantle that protection wasn't ignorance, it was willful harm. Outside the courthouse, rain fell on rebuilt channels that now guided water safely where it needed to go. Months later, construction began on the new dam, funded through federal grants and restitution, designed to last longer than any HOA board ever would. My aquaculture business restarted with community backing that felt earned, not requested. Kids came to see the fish, to learn why water behaves the way it does, why engineering matters. Sometimes I'd catch someone looking at the flowing spillway with a different expression than before, not annoyance, but respect.
On quiet mornings, I'd sit with coffee, listening to water move with purpose again, thinking about how close arrogance had come to rewriting the valley in disaster. The lesson wasn't abstract, it was visible in repaired homes, in changed leadership, in a community that tried to erase a century of protection, now depended on that same knowledge to survive. And somewhere in a cell far from the mountains, Colin Grant was learning the same thing without the option to spin it.
In the weeks after the flood, Riverstone Estates stopped feeling like a development and started feeling like a reckoning zone, because when water pulls secrets out of the ground, it doesn't put them back neatly. Mud lines on living room walls marked exactly how wrong the assumptions had been, and every soaked carpet became physical evidence that warnings had been ignored on purpose. Temporary housing trailers lined the edge of town. Insurance adjusters crawled through streets with clipboards, and the sound of industrial fans drying out basements became the neighborhood's new background noise. I moved through it all quietly, not as a victor, but as someone cataloging outcomes. My sensors kept logging data, my notebooks filled with observations, and my inbox filled with messages from attorneys, engineers, and agencies now circling the case like gravity itself had summoned them. The federal oversight team remained on site, documenting the aftermath with the same methodical precision they'd used during demolition, because when infrastructure fails due to human interference, every detail matters. Colin Grant, meanwhile, was learning what it felt like to be cut off from the levers he'd abused. His bail conditions restricted contact, froze accounts, and barred him from any HOA-related activity, which effectively erased the identity he'd built for himself. His lawyers tried spinning narratives about unforeseen consequences and shared responsibility, but the paper trail didn't care. Bank records, emails, audit summaries, all told the same story in different fonts. The district attorney expanded charges to include conspiracy, and suddenly people who'd once laughed with Colin on golf courses were requesting separate counsel. I watched it unfold with a strange detachment, because once physics has delivered its verdict, the legal system just fills in footnotes. Reconstruction planning meetings replaced emergency briefings. Engineers from 3 firms debated channel geometry, spillway angles, and retention capacity, all referencing my great-grandfather's original notes like they were ancient schematics rediscovered at the right moment. The new design would handle 160% of projected peak runoff, accounting for climate variability nobody wanted to acknowledge before. Federal funding covered most of it, supplemented by restitution payments already being extracted from Colin's seized assets. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd tried to erase flood control was now financing its expansion. Community attitudes shifted visibly. People who once avoided eye contact stopped me to ask questions, not confrontational ones, but curious ones. Why did water behave like that? Why had the valley flooded historically? Why hadn't anyone explained this before? I answered without preaching, because explanation sticks better than scolding. A local school invited me to speak to students about watershed dynamics, and watching teenagers suddenly understand why maps matter felt more productive than any argument I'd had with an HOA board. The media cycle moved on, but the legal machinery didn't. Court dates stacked. Depositions dragged on for hours as attorneys walked witnesses through invoices, signatures, and timelines. One former inspector broke down halfway through testimony, admitting he'd been pressured to file reports without inspections, payments disguised as consulting fees padding his income. Each confession tightened the net. The Attorney General's office announced that multiple officials were under review for misconduct, and resignations followed quietly, without press conferences. I returned to work on my aquaculture operation, rebuilding stock, replanting beds, restoring systems that had been disrupted by months of chaos. The pond, temporarily drained during reconstruction, refilled slowly under controlled conditions, water returning like an old friend who needed reassurance before settling back in. Trout fingerlings were released, monitored carefully, and within weeks, the ecosystem showed signs of balance returning. Life adapts faster than bureaucracy. One afternoon, Linda Perez stopped by with copies of finalized HOA bylaws, transparency requirements, independent audits, term limits. The reforms read like a checklist of everything Colin had circumvented. She laughed once, tired but genuine, and said she never wanted to sit through another emergency meeting again. I understood. Accountability is exhausting, but the alternative costs more. Sentencing came in stages. Colin pled guilty to multiple counts, avoiding a trial that would have aired every detail in open court. The judge imposed prison time measured in years, not months, restitution orders totaling $8.1 million, and a lifetime prohibition from managing any homeowners association or development entity. When the sentence was read, there was no drama, just finality. His appeal window closed quickly. With evidence that dense, arguments thin out fast. Reconstruction finished before the next major melt. The new dam rose where the old had stood, reinforced concrete blended with limestone facing sourced from the same quarry my great-grandfather had used, a deliberate nod to continuity. Sensors embedded in the structure fed live data to county systems, ensuring that nobody could ever again claim ignorance. A historical marker was installed nearby, understated, factual, describing the original construction, its destruction, and its replacement. No villains named. Facts don't need embellishment. The first full runoff under the new system passed without incident. Water levels rose, spilled, receded, exactly as designed. Streets stayed dry, basements stayed empty. The community watched, collectively holding a breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding for years. My business stabilized, then grew. Restaurants placed standing orders for trout. A small market opened near the road, selling produce and educational pamphlets about local water systems. Visitors stopped to read the marker, to ask questions, to take photos that weren't selfies of destruction, but records of something working as intended. Occasionally, someone would ask if I regretted not stopping the demolition sooner. I answered honestly. Once sabotage happened, the safest path was controlled failure. Engineering is about choosing the least bad option when perfect ones are gone. That answer didn't always satisfy, but it was true. The valley settled into a new normal, quieter, more informed. HOA meetings became boring, which is the highest compliment you can pay them. Kids grew up knowing where the creek used to run, why it mattered, and why pretending otherwise had consequences. On certain mornings, when mist rose off the pond again, the scene felt familiar in a way that suggested continuity rather than repetition. My great-grandfather's work hadn't been erased, it had been translated into a language modern systems understood. And somewhere, far from the mountains, Colin Grant woke up each day without an audience, without authority, confronted by the reality that you can't negotiate with gravity or bully water into obedience. The story didn't end with applause. It ended with flow restored, systems corrected, and a community forced to learn what happens when arrogance meets physics.
By the time the second runoff season arrived, Riverstone Estates barely resembled the place that had tried to bury me under paperwork and threats, because disasters don't just reshape land, they rearrange people. The temporary trailers were gone, replaced by repaired homes and elevated foundations that acknowledged reality instead of denying it. Streets that once dipped arrogantly into natural channels were regraded, drainage culverts widened, retention basins installed with signage that explained exactly why they existed. The new dam stood upstream like a quiet sentinel, not flashy, not decorative, just competent, which in engineering is the highest praise. Sensors embedded in its spine transmitted real-time data to county servers, numbers updating on dashboards that anyone could access. Transparency, it turned out, made people calmer. When you can see water levels for yourself, you don't need someone else telling you what to fear. My role shifted subtly from defendant to reference point. County planners asked for input on other aging structures. Nearby towns called to ask whether their creeks had similar histories they'd ignored. I answered questions carefully, sticking to facts, because facts had been enough to break a system built on intimidation. Meanwhile, the legal aftershocks continued. Depositions expanded beyond the HOA, pulling in vendors who'd padded invoices, inspectors who'd rubber-stamped reports, consultants who'd never consulted on anything but their own bank balances. One by one, deals were cut, fines were levied, licenses were revoked. It wasn't dramatic justice, but it was thorough, the kind that discourages repeat performances. I sat through a few hearings out of obligation, watching former power brokers speak softly into microphones, suddenly precise about dates and amounts they'd once treated casually. The contrast was educational. Accountability doesn't roar. It whispers details until there's nowhere left to hide. Colin Grant faded from headlines, but not from consequences. Restitution payments were structured to extract value from every remaining asset. Properties sold, accounts drained, even his retirement funds were tapped under civil judgments. Each update arrived by mail, dry language describing the dismantling of a life built on leverage. I didn't celebrate it, I noted it.
Engineering teaches you to observe outcomes without attachment. The valley, meanwhile, leaned into education. The town council approved funding for watershed signage along trails, explaining historical flow paths, floodplains, and the role of infrastructure in shaping settlement. A local teacher asked me to help design a curriculum module for high school students, and standing in front of a class with maps spread across desks, watching them trace water routes with their fingers, felt like prevention in its purest form. You don't fight ignorance by yelling at it, you starve it of mystery. My aquaculture operation expanded steadily. The pond, now integrated into the new system, supported healthier flows, more consistent temperatures, better habitat. Harvest numbers climbed without stress. Restaurants marketed the fish as local and resilient, a phrase that carried more meaning than they probably intended. I hired 2 employees from the neighborhood, people whose homes had flooded, not out of charity, but because they understood exactly why the work mattered. On weekends, families visited to watch feeding cycles, kids pointing excitedly when trout broke the surface. It felt grounded, earned, but not everyone learned quietly. A small group of former HOA loyalists tried to rewrite the narrative, claiming the flood would have happened anyway, that no structure could have stopped it, that the dam was symbolic rather than functional. They circulated opinion pieces, vague and confident, until one of the hydrology firms published a public-facing summary of their models, complete with before and after comparisons that showed exactly how the dam had delayed, diverted, and reduced peak flows. Data has a way of humiliating speculation. The commentary dried up after that. I found myself invited to meetings I once would have been excluded from, regional planning sessions, emergency preparedness workshops, even a state task force on infrastructure resilience asked for my input. I didn't chase any of it. I accepted selectively, because influence only works when it's rooted in credibility, not ambition. At one meeting, a planner asked what lesson Riverstone should share with other communities. I answered simply, stop treating infrastructure like an aesthetic problem. It's not there to look good, it's there to work. The sentence made it into the minutes verbatim. Reconstruction funds flowed into projects that had been stalled for years, culverts replaced, bridges reinforced, old maps dusted off and compared to new satellite imagery. The valley became a case study, cited in journals and conferences as an example of cascading failure triggered by governance abuse. My great-grandfather's original notes were archived digitally, referenced by modern engineers who recognized the intuition embedded in hand-drawn lines. Seeing his work translated into code and equations felt like continuity rather than appropriation. Personally, the quiet returned. Mornings went back to coffee and water sounds, though the sound had changed slightly, deeper, steadier, engineered for longevity. I'd catch myself listening longer than necessary, not out of nostalgia, but calibration. Engineers trust systems by watching them operate under ordinary conditions. Extraordinary ones are just stress tests. Occasionally, someone would ask if I regretted fighting as hard as I did, if it had been worth the months of stress and uncertainty. I answered honestly, the cost of not fighting would have been higher, paid over years in repairs, fear, and denial. Conflict compresses pain, avoidance spreads it out. Late one afternoon, Linda Perez stopped by with a box of old HOA records slated for disposal, cleaned and redacted, asking if I wanted anything preserved. We went through them together, laughing once at the absurdity of some invoices, shaking our heads at others. We saved the audit summaries, the reform votes, the first clean financial statement the HOA had produced in a decade. History isn't just what goes wrong, it's what gets fixed. That winter, snowpack climbed again, though not dramatically. When melt season came, the new system performed exactly as designed. No alerts, no evacuations, just water moving through channels that acknowledged its presence. The difference between disaster and normalcy, I realized, wasn't the absence of water, but the presence of respect. By then, the community had internalized something subtle but important. Systems fail fastest when people pretend they don't exist. On the anniversary of the flood, a small gathering formed near the dam, not a ceremony, just neighbors standing quietly, watching flow rates displayed on a public screen. No speeches, no cameras, just observation. Someone brought coffee, someone else pointed out how clear the water looked. It felt complete in a way arguments never do. The story had stopped being about one man's abuse of power and started being about a place learning its boundaries. And somewhere far away, behind concrete walls and schedules he didn't control, Colin Grant woke up to days that all looked the same, stripped of the urgency he once manufactured. The valley moved on without him, systems humming, lessons embedded, water flowing where it always wanted to go. 5 years after the flood, the valley didn't feel victorious. It felt calibrated, like a machine finally running at the speed it was always designed for, and that difference mattered more than celebration ever could. The rebuilt dam had faded into the background of daily life, which was exactly the point. People stopped taking pictures of it. Kids stopped asking why it was there. Water rose, spilled, and receded on schedule, boring and perfect. Riverstone Estates had become something rare, a place that respected limits. Homes rebuilt after the disaster followed floodplain logic without argument. Insurance premiums stabilized, property values recovered, not because the land was conquered, but because it was understood. The memory of chaos remained, not as fear, but as context, the kind that quietly informs better decisions. I still lived upstream, still woke to the sound of water moving with intention, but my role had changed. I wasn't defending anything anymore. I was maintaining it. That distinction mattered. Maintenance is humility in action. It assumes failure is always possible and prepares for it without drama. My days settled into a pattern that felt earned rather than imposed. Morning checks of flow data, feeding cycles at the pond, consult calls from towns that wanted audits, not arguments. I chose projects carefully, avoiding places that wanted validation instead of truth. The Riverstone case had taught me that real resilience comes from boring preparation, not loud promises. Occasionally, I'd receive updates from the legal aftermath, final settlements closing, liens resolved, names disappearing from public records. Colin Grant's sentence concluded quietly, without ceremony, followed by a supervised release into a world that no longer offered him shortcuts. He never reached out. I never expected him to. Some lessons don't need conversations, they need boundaries. The community, for its part, had internalized those boundaries. HOA meetings became procedural, transparent, almost dull. Budgets were published, audits scheduled automatically. No single person held unchecked authority. The structure outlasted the personalities, which is the only metric that matters. One spring, a storm hit harder than forecast, dumping rain on top of early melt, the kind of combination that used to spark panic. This time, alerts went out calmly, retention basins filled, spillways engaged, emergency crews stood by, unused. By morning, water levels stabilized and dropped. People talked about it over coffee, impressed but unsurprised. That reaction was the real proof. Crisis had been replaced by expectation. The visitor center expanded modestly, not as a monument, but as a resource. We added interactive models showing how small changes upstream magnified downstream effects. Students traced paths with their fingers, watched simulations adjust in real time. I never framed it as my story. It wasn't. It was a system story. My great-grandfather's notes were displayed behind glass, his handwriting translated into modern diagrams, not to glorify him, but to show continuity. Engineering is a conversation across generations, not a solo performance. On quiet evenings, when the pond reflected the sky just right, I'd think about how close the valley had come to learning the same lesson the hard way again, and how easily it could happen elsewhere. Power, when unchecked, always looks for shortcuts. Nature doesn't allow them. That tension will never disappear. The best we can do is document, prepare, and refuse to be intimidated by noise. I started writing summaries of cases I'd consulted on, anonymized, factual, distributed to planning boards and emergency managers. No drama, just sequences of cause and effect. Those documents traveled farther than any headline ever did. Prevention rarely gets credit, but it compounds quietly. One afternoon, while walking the downstream channel, I ran into a family that had moved into one of the rebuilt homes. They didn't know my name, they didn't know the history, they just knew their basement stayed dry and the creek stayed where it belonged. That anonymity felt like success. Systems should protect people who never think about them. As years passed, Riverstone became a reference point in textbooks and training sessions, a case where arrogance met physics and physics won without compromise. Not because someone shouted louder, but because reality doesn't negotiate. The dam, old and new, had done its job, even in destruction. That paradox stayed with me. Sometimes protection means standing firm. Sometimes it means letting failure happen in the least harmful way possible, so the truth becomes unavoidable. Either way, responsibility doesn't disappear, it transfers. On the 10th anniversary of the flood, a small plaque was installed near the water, simple, unadorned. It didn't name villains or heroes. It stated facts, dates, actions, outcomes. That was enough. Standing there, listening to water flow over stone engineered to last centuries, I understood that legacy isn't what you build once, it's what you maintain when nobody's watching. The valley had learned that, so had I. And if there's one thing this entire experience burned into my bones, it's this: corrupt authority thrives on silence, confusion, and people assuming someone else will handle it. It collapses under documentation, shared knowledge, and stubborn attention. If you've ever watched an HOA, a board, or an official overreach because they thought nobody would push back, you already know how this starts. The difference is how it ends. If this story hit close to home, if you've seen power abused in small, everyday ways that nobody takes seriously until it's too late, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Talk about it. The more these stories circulate, the harder it becomes for the next Colin Grant to operate in the dark. Drop your own HOA nightmare in the comments, because the worst patterns only survive when people think they're alone. And if you want more real stories where intimidation runs headfirst into reality and loses, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. These aren't just stories, they're warnings. 5 years after the flood, the valley didn't feel victorious. It felt calibrated, like a machine finally running at the speed it was always designed for, and that difference mattered more than celebration ever could. The rebuilt dam had faded into the background of daily life, which was exactly the point. People stopped taking pictures of it. Kids stopped asking why it was there. Water rose, spilled, and receded on schedule, boring and perfect. Riverstone Estates had become something rare, a place that respected limits. Homes rebuilt after the disaster followed floodplain logic without argument. Insurance premiums stabilized, property values recovered, not because the land was conquered, but because it was understood. The memory of chaos remained, not as fear, but as context, the kind that quietly informs better decisions. I still lived upstream, still woke to the sound of water moving with intention, but my role had changed. I wasn't defending anything anymore. I was maintaining it. That distinction mattered. Maintenance is humility in action. It assumes failure is always possible and prepares for it without drama. My days settled into a pattern that felt earned rather than imposed. Morning checks of flow data, feeding cycles at the pond, console calls from towns that wanted audits, not arguments. I chose projects carefully, avoiding places that wanted validation instead of truth. The Riverstone case had taught me that real resilience comes from boring preparation, not loud promises. Occasionally, I'd receive updates from the legal aftermath, final settlements closing, liens resolved, names disappearing from public records. Colin Grant's sentence concluded quietly, without ceremony, followed by a supervised release into a world that no longer offered him shortcuts. He never reached out. I never expected him to. Some lessons don't need conversations, they need boundaries. The community, for its part, had internalized those boundaries. HOA meetings became procedural, transparent, almost dull. Budgets were published, audits scheduled automatically. No single person held unchecked authority. The structure outlasted the personalities, which is the only metric that matters. One spring, a storm hit harder than forecast, dumping rain on top of early melt, the kind of combination that used to spark panic. This time, alerts went out calmly, retention basins filled, spillways engaged, emergency crews stood by, unused. By morning, water levels stabilized and dropped. People talked about it over coffee, impressed but unsurprised. That reaction was the real proof. Crisis had been replaced by expectation. The visitor center expanded modestly, not as a monument, but as a resource. We added interactive models showing how small changes upstream magnified downstream effects. Students traced paths with their fingers, watched simulations adjust in real time. I never framed it as my story. It wasn't. It was a system story. My great-grandfather's notes were displayed behind glass, his handwriting translated into modern diagrams, not to glorify him, but to show continuity. Engineering is a conversation across generations, not a solo performance. On quiet evenings, when the pond reflected the sky just right, I'd think about how close the valley had come to learning the same lesson the hard way again, and how easily it could happen elsewhere. Power, when unchecked, always looks for shortcuts. Nature doesn't allow them. That tension will never disappear. The best we can do is document, prepare, and refuse to be intimidated by noise. I started writing summaries of cases I'd consulted on, anonymized, factual, distributed to planning boards and emergency managers. No drama, just sequences of cause and effect. Those documents traveled farther than any headline ever did. Prevention rarely gets credit, but it compounds quietly. One afternoon, while walking the downstream channel, I ran into a family that had moved into one of the rebuilt homes. They didn't know my name, they didn't know the history, they just knew their basement stayed dry and the creek stayed where it belonged. That anonymity felt like success. Systems should protect people who never think about them. As years passed, Riverstone became a reference point in textbooks and training sessions, a case where arrogance met physics and physics won without compromise. Not because someone shouted louder, but because reality doesn't negotiate. The dam, old and new, had done its job, even in destruction. That paradox stayed with me. Sometimes protection means standing firm. Sometimes it means letting failure happen in the least harmful way possible, so the truth becomes unavoidable. Either way, responsibility doesn't disappear, it transfers. On the 10th anniversary of the flood, a small plaque was installed near the water, simple, unadorned. It didn't name villains or heroes. It stated facts, dates, actions, outcomes. That was enough. Standing there, listening to water flow over stone engineered to last centuries, I understood that legacy isn't what you build once, it's what you maintain when nobody's watching. The valley had learned that, so had I. And if there's one thing this entire experience burned into my bones, it's this. Corrupt authority thrives on silence, confusion, and people assuming someone else will handle it. It collapses under documentation, shared knowledge, and stubborn attention. If you've ever watched an HOA, a board, or an official overreach because they thought nobody would push back, you already know how this starts. The difference is how it ends. If this story hit close to home, if you've seen power abused in small, everyday ways that nobody takes seriously until it's too late, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Talk about it. The more these stories circulate, the harder it becomes for the next Colin Grant to operate in the dark. Drop your own HOA nightmare in the comments, because the worst patterns only survive when people think they're alone. And if you want more real stories where intimidation runs headfirst into reality and loses, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. These aren't just stories, they're warnings.